Good evening, and welcome to the second in our ongoing series of programs this week dealing with civil rights issues in commemoration, celebration of the 50th anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. This evening, like all of these programs, I think they're all just special attack actually, but this one is certainly no exception. We will be dealing with a very central and key and upfront, obviously, in the news, as far as the news is concerned, issue of the day, you might say, and it is definitely a civil rights issue if ever there was one. Just to give you a quick preview of what's going to be going on the next couple of days, tomorrow night we're going to be doing a program on integration and how it has affected Native Americans over the years. Ray Cross will be the first speaker. He's an attorney at the University of Montana who has nationally known expertise in the area of school integration and as it applied and pertained to Native Americans. He'll probably be addressing it from a Montana perspective, certainly. And there also will be another event going on just prior, just like we had the video this evening, just prior to this program. There's going to be another event going on right before people will be meeting here, and Gigi Wykes would like to just talk to you just for a second about what that's about.
Tomorrow's topic of Indian integration in Montana, Carol Juneau has been instrumental in the legislative success of removing derogatory names from geographic place names in Montana, and she is going to be announcing the new name for the peak west of Missoula tomorrow at 6:30 at the Waterfront Pasta House. So you're all welcome to tell your friends about that event. It's going to then hopefully dovetail very well with this panel, the panel tomorrow evening at 7.
Yes, and she promised me every single person who's going to that will be led by the nose over here.
We're going to shove them all over here. So just pass the word. Thank you.
And finally on Thursday we have this kind of a broad overview, summation you might say, of what the Brown decision really was all about, placing it in its historical context. And that should be quite good as well. That will be on Thursday evening. We've got a program in the back. There's also lots of material that Betty brought us from the Human Rights Network, dealing with some of the issues she'll be speaking about this evening. And that's all on that table back there. One final thing I got to mention, I should have mentioned it right up front. These programs are being sponsored by the Missoula Public Library Foundation. There are flyers about the Library Foundation also back on the table. The foundation is a very special support group for the public library here. They've done many wonderful things for this library, such as buying computer equipment, video materials, things like this, and also paying for continuing education opportunities for members of the library staff. Things that we can't afford to do out of the regular library budget, the things that we'd like to do that aren't a vital necessity, but it certainly made this library a much better place for all of us here in Missoula. So, I will introduce the first speaker without further ado this evening. Carl Olson. Carl has been the executive director of PRIDE since 1999, and PRIDE is Montana's only statewide gay, lesbian, bi, and trans advocacy organization. Prior to his involvement with PRIDE, Carl created an HIV prevention program in Montana. He raised money for reproductive rights and was also a program officer with the YMCA. Would you please welcome Carl Olson? I didn't tell you, you can either come up here or remain seated, so I'll leave that up to you.
Well, I'm quite comfortable here.
Cool.
Thanks, Don. And just to correct the record, I created an HIV prevention program in Omaha, not in Montana. I'm going to start out tonight reading a passage from one of my favorite writers, Rick Bass. He's a wilderness advocate and author from up in the Yak. And we were really privileged to have Rick join us for a Pride event in Bozeman a few years ago. And he gave this same speech. And it's from a book about the Yak called The Roadless Yak. And he talks about what he has called the glacier principle. He also calls it the community of glaciers. Rick Bass says, a glacier isn't just a chunk of ice, static, frozen in time. We know that glaciers are like rivers sliding through time, up one valley, down the next, with the laminar grace of wind or flowing water. That it is only when we try to compress the life of a glacier into the scale of our own short lives that the life leaves them, and they cease, or so it appears to our eyes, to move. The common definition of a glacier is any patch of earth where snow remains present year-round, with a depth of ice accumulating across time. But what interests me is the point where a glacier, having invested decades in patient endurance, finally gains enough overburden and ceases to act as what it was up until that point, and instead, it turns into a slippery, living fluid and begins flowing down the mountain, carving a new world, finally, and setting new rules. What I think now is that activism is not like laying stones across a river or stacking one's words and deeds in an ongoing, eternal rock wall, but rather that it is like being snowed upon in winter, that one's life is not nearly so significant or dramatic as a rock wall, but it is instead far more silent, made up often of a lifetime of snow, that our lives and work are nothing more and nothing less. All those years of waiting, all those years of close but no cigar, for under the laws of physics, it makes no difference if there is 10 feet of ice or 50 feet of ice. It's not until the 60th foot where movement is achieved. You can be real close for a long time and still go nowhere. Surely there must be an audible, tangible release of relief in that interface between glacier and mountain. What must it feel like for the glacier at that point as it finally comes to life? Some of the ice at the bottom of certain glaciers has been measured to be 25,000 years old. And I feel that we are almost on the verge of seeing a glacier come to life in the area of gay and lesbian equality. Yesterday, Massachusetts became the first state in the nation to legally marry same-gender couples. And by my estimation, we have nearly, but not quite, 60 feet of ice. If efforts to amend our state and U.S. constitutions are defeated, we could see one or two last layers of activist snowflakes. Couples who married in Massachusetts will return to their home states or move to other states and challenge marriage discrimination in those places. Eventually, those challenges will reach the U.S. Supreme Court, and eventually our country will discover that the Constitution does not support marriage apartheid. The glacier will slip, carve out a fresh civil rights victory, and forever change our cultural landscape. If discrimination is amended into our constitutions, we'll see a dry spell. No more snowflakes for a while. Our glacier has experienced dry spells like this before. They don't last forever. Constitutions are not built to carry the load of discriminatory amendments. And eventually, something like the Marriage Discrimination Amendment, if passed, will be reversed and thrown on the trash heap of historic mistakes our country has made in the ongoing struggle to define citizenship. Without taking you 25,000 feet below to the bottom of my glacier, I invite you to examine some of the strata beneath the expanse we call civil marriage. And I invite you to notice how religion, race, and sex compound the issue of civil marriage equality. Here are some of the high and low points. Civil marriage had been made the law of the land in the Netherlands in 1590, so we can blame it on the Netherlands. What that means for us here is that after the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, they established the Dutch custom of civil marriage, which they had picked up when they were in the Netherlands. The first marriage in New England was officiated in 1621 by the governor. Clergy would not arrive in Plymouth for another 8 years, but even then, marriage continued as a civil affair for another 70 years. The colonists, feeling the sting of religious bigotry that they had experienced in England, were hesitant to blend together a civil rite, R-I-T-E, and a sacred ritual. In Montana history, same-sex ceremonial marriages figure prominently in the oral histories of several Native American nations, among them the Blackfeet and the Salish. Same-sex couples were observed by early explorers and writers like Lewis and Clark, David Thompson, Father De Smet, George Bird Grinnell, and were often described by these European Americans in marital terms. Let's visit race a bit. In 1913, Massachusetts passed a law that required couples from other states to prove their home state would recognize a marriage contracted in Massachusetts. This was an effort to bar mixed-race couples from getting married in Massachusetts and then returning home to stir up trouble by demanding legal recognition of their family status. Today, that 1913 law is being used to keep gay couples from doing the same, though some municipalities are defying that law. In the 1920s, we saw an effort to amend the U.S. Constitution to prohibit interracial marriages. It was loudly promoted but never successful. In 1948, California became the first state to end marriage discrimination for mixed-race couples. In the 1950s, Hannah Arendt wrote, "The right to marry whoever one wishes is an elementary human right. Even political rights like the right to vote and nearly all other rights enumerated in the Constitution are secondary to the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to this category, the right to home and marriage unquestionably belongs." End quote. In 1967, we have Loving versus Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that nullified all state bans on interracial marriage. In their decision, the court called marriage a civil right. We also have sex. In 1997, the Montana Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the intimate relationships of gay or lesbian couples are not a crime. This decision gave gay Montanans the freedom to love and be loved in the privacy of their own homes without fear or retribution. Our court said, while legislative enactments may reflect the will of the majority, there are certain rights so fundamental that they will not be denied to a minority, no matter how despised by society. In 2003, on June 26th, the U.S. Supreme Court nullified all of the remaining anti-gay sex laws in 13 states. Montana had an edge on the rest of the country here. This national policy shift was the result of a Texas case where police stormed the bedroom of a gay couple and arrested them. Then we come to marriage, other aspects of marriage. In 1997, President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. DOMA defines marriage as between a man and a woman and releases the states from responsibility of legally recognizing the gay unions of other states. And Clinton prepared ads for Christian 'radio stations promoting his defense of marriage. In 1999, Vermont becomes the first state to create a system of civil unions for its gay citizens. Civil unions allow couples to access many but not all of the benefits and protections their heterosexual neighbors enjoy. The Vermont Supreme Court predicted that the challenge for future generations will be to define what is most essentially human, to acknowledge plaintiffs as Vermonters who seek nothing more nor less than legal protection and security for their avowed commitment to an intimate and lasting human relationship is simply a recognition of our common humanity. And then we could move down to 2003 when the Federal Marriage Amendment is drafted. FMA would alter the U.S. Constitution by prohibiting any legal recognition and protections for same-sex couples, including but not limited to marriage. We have a similar amendment then that was introduced a few months later here in Montana. Around this same time, an early civil rights pioneer and freedom rider from the South, now a senator or a representative from Georgia, John Lewis, wrote, "It is time to say forthrightly that the government's exclusion of our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters from civil marriage officially degrades them and their families. I've heard the reasons for opposing civil marriage for same-sex couples. Cut through the distractions, and they stink of the same fear, hatred, and intolerance I have known in racism and bigotry." That brings me to May 17th, which is yesterday, and the first same-gender marriages were legal in the United States. There are obviously lots of high points and low points in between. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, several months ago in their decision, which led to the victory we saw yesterday, they wrote, "The exclusive commitment of two individuals to each other nurtures love and mutual support. It brings stability to our society. Without the right to marry, or more properly, the right to choose to marry, one is excluded from the full range of human experience and denied full protection of the laws." So where does this all lead? I'll let Frank Rich from the New York Times answer that, in what he calls the denouement of the epic drama over gay marriage. Frank Rich says, it's going to happen within a generation, and it's going to happen even though George W. Bush teed off his re-election campaign this week by calling for a constitutional amendment to outlaw it. One could argue perhaps that the debate over what is popularly called gay marriage isn't really about gays and lesbians, and probably not really about marriage. Maybe it's about an expanding universe, an expanding social space, and expanding freedoms. And if so, this is really an ageless story, one that, unlike a glacier, will never come to rest. And that's unsettling for some of us, and for some of us, it's very exciting.
Thank you, Carl. I couldn't help thinking when he was talking about the idea of gay marriage being an idea whose time has come. I can still recall in a college class I took in 1968, the professor asked us at that time, how many of you feel you're prejudiced against black people? And of course nobody raised their hand. But then he said, he asked the second question, how many of you would allow your daughter to marry a black person? And no one raised their hand. So times do change. Our next speaker, Betty Kievsky, is an organizer for the Montana Human Rights Network. Her work focuses on anti-gay harassment in Montana schools. I know a lot of you were here earlier and saw the very moving video that's been done on Montana gay youth speaking out. She's a founding member of the Montana Safe Schools Coalition. Betty has worked extensively with youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, or those who are perceived to be. And along with them, their allies, their parents, and their friends. Betty, again, if you feel more comfortable up here.
No, I think sitting's way safer. It's just I always like to listen to Carl talk because he does a good job. So, I was thinking about Brown versus the Board of Education, and because the anniversary was yesterday, and thinking about what a historic changing thing that was for the United States. It did end segregation here, but another piece of it was that it also provided equal access to education for African American youth. Without Brown, change surely would have been slower and more difficult. Fortunately, the Supreme Court had the power to do what Congress and other institutions, sometimes schools, could not do and would not do. Brown went on to be the legal underpinning for civil rights movement, which eventually included women and handicapped Americans. So I started to think and ponder the question, can the Brown decision's fundamental claim that discrimination and segregation are unconstitutional and immoral apply to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered youth trying to access their education in today's school? Segregation of gay youth does not happen. Or does it? That was the question I had in my mind right after I said, well, it's not quite the same. But when I look at recent events, it has become more and more popular to create high schools that are for queer youth only. The difference in this kind of segregation is that it is done under the guise of safety. Schools offer this as the only way they can provide safety for gay youth. In reality, it is not the only way. It is the easy way, relieving the school and the community at large from addressing the anti-gay bias that creates the hostile environment in the first place. To segregate these victims, not educate the perpetrators, and ignore the hostile environments that exist in school perpetuates the discrimination at its core. There is also the issue of alternative schools, often the second stop on a gay youth's search for safe, secure, and peaceful environments to access their education. This alternative is offered by many schools as a place to go that will be safer than the mainstream school. In my experience, this generally proves to be anything but a safe school. No, this is not the same as racial segregation. We have come too far as a society to tolerate such outright bigotry. But today we opt for more subtle approaches to discriminating against our gay youth. A common tool in Montana is to deny that queer youth exist. I often hear, we don't have anyone like that in this school. It's not a problem here. We had one gay student, but they're gone. These statements accept the myth that all gay people are easily identifiable and that only those students who identify themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered are targeted by anti-gay harassment. Another common way of discriminating is to say these issues have no place in our schools. This ignores the rampant anti-gay climate that already exists inside schools. When students observe, participate in, or are the targets of anti-gay harassment and abuse, and when there is no official policy in place with a trained professional to enforce it, the message is very clear. This kind of abuse is acceptable. The lack of visible role models, the absence of accurate information on historical and current contributions of gays and lesbians in society, the absence of comprehensive, medically accurate health education become other tools used to further isolate and demonize gay youth. For LGBT youth, too often survival, not education, becomes their primary focus. The overall result of hostile school environments is that gay youth spend a disproportionate amount of time and energy plotting how to stay safe, avoid verbal and physical attacks. When teachers choose to ignore verbal harassment or dismiss its significance, they help reinforce the hostile environment that the targeted student is powerless to change. Youth being targeted get the message that they are not worthy of protection and that it is an inevitable consequence of being gay. Often there is a deliberate indifference a deliberate indifference to this abuse by school officials who sometimes blame abused students of provoking the attacks by not fitting rigid stereotypes of traditional gender roles. Sometimes they have gone so far to tell the student, "What do you expect if you insist on being gay?" These instances illustrate the larger problems, a systematic failure of school systems to protect LGBT students. Students are left to choose between struggling in isolation and dropping out to escape the ever-escalating violence. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services estimates that 28% of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth choose to drop out. So how do we create change? Does your school have a non-discrimination policy? Does it have an anti-harassment policy? And if it does it include sexual orientation and gender identity? It's a question to be asked. Do the teachers and staff and administration get training on how to address anti-gay bias in the school? How many counselors in your school district have had training on these issues? Statistics tell us that only 20% of school counselors have had any training whatsoever on LGBT issues. Is there a gay-straight alliance in your school? Is it under attack from people outside of the school? Do they need you to call them and say, you know, we really support the high school having this gay-straight alliance. We think it's a good thing. And the library, the one place that gay youth often go to find out information about themselves. Is it a safe place? Will the librarian get them the books they need? But more importantly, does the library have a policy to print the lists of overdue books and who has them? Because if your school has that policy, gay youth won't use that library. Is there resources at the school for a parent struggling with the newfound knowledge that their child is gay and lesbian? Can they go to the school and find out things? Can they get support? And do we stop the language every time we hear it? Or are we too busy not wanting to cause a fuss? I told them earlier I got myself a mantra. I have a statement that I say when I hear it. I try not to say it in a very neutral tone. And I usually say something along the lines of, I have gay and lesbian friends, and I'm not comfortable with that comment that you just made, and I would prefer that we talked about something else. It's not always the appropriate time to educate. If it is, then I try and do that as well. But what I really want you to understand, or I hope that I can help you to understand, is that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender youth, like all other students, have the inalienable right to safe, secure, and peaceful schools, and the right to access their education and have the opportunity to learn. And as community, as parents, it is our duty. I really feel that this, at the core of my being, it is my responsibility to make sure that the school knows that I support them doing that.
Thanks, Betty. I think possibly at the core, this issue is religious. It certainly has a strong, very strong religious overtones. So I wanted to be sure to include a member of the clergy on the panel this evening. My original choice was Pastor Jean Larson. Jean called me this afternoon. She has a terrible cold. So for those of you who were expecting Jean to be here, she couldn't make it at the last minute. She's got that same cold I think a lot of us have had this winter. But anyway, she did have enough energy to call Pastor Peter Strober. And he was very, very gracious enough to, at the very last minute, agree to come and speak to us tonight on the same issues I'm sure that Pastor Dean Larson would have addressed. And he is extremely qualified to do this. He is Pastor Strober for the last 13 years has been the pastor at the University Congregation of the United Church of Christ. And if any of you know about denominations and their where they are with the acceptance of gays and with dealing with or being able to handle the gay issue, you know that the United Church of Christ certainly is at the forefront. Other churches certainly are dealing with it, or if they aren't, they soon will be. But right near the forefront and pioneering, I think, in this area has been the Church of Christ. Prior to his coming to Missoula, Pastor Strober lived in Washington State for a time. He's married. His wife, Barbara Cowan. They have 3 children, one at Hellgate High School, one at Washington Middle School, and one at Paxson Elementary. Pastor, again, you can stay there or come up here.
Okay. I don't mind being the backup to Gene. Gene's a great person. And I was sitting here thinking that it's an honor and it's humbling to be up here with Carl and Betty. The work they do is so important, and it's hard work. And it's the kind of work where you're stretched really thin all the time. And I just appreciate what you do. It's important. I was born in 1954, so I was born the same year that Brown versus Board of Education came about, and I recognized that a couple months ago, when they started talking about it having been 50 years ago, and thought how my life has been impacted by that in remarkable ways. There was a kind of an op-ed in the paper today in the Missoulian that had the kind of headline that said Integration Day, and it talked about integration in all kinds of evocative ways. That as a people we yearn to have a sense of integration, of togetherness, and these past 50 years have been a remarkable half-century of things falling apart, of things becoming integrated. It's been a painful half-century. It's been a promising one. It's been hopeful, and it's been full of despair as well. I asked Carl before we came up how he was doing, and he, was saying, if I can paraphrase, my sense was he wasn't quite sure. There's so much going on. And it's so hard to know where you might be in the midst of all of that, particularly in the kind of work you both do. I thought about a line. I was saying to Carl, well, the landscape really is changing. But with what's been going on this week, it's been changing in a wonderful sort of way. And you're in the midst of it all. And it's hard to see that. It's hard to see the large landscape when your own part of the world is so filled with so many things. It makes me think of a line by John Runyon. He once wrote that there is thunder on the horizon, but there is also the dawn. And I think that's very true for these times we live in. It's thunderous, and it's dawning, and we get to be a part of it. It's wonderful. I'd like to, these guys had really nice scripts that they read from and everything, and I didn't have time to put one together. But I do have a couple of stories I'd like to tell. And as a preacher, I don't know time. So you let me know when I don't have.
We're doing well so far.
We talk about timeless truths in timely ways, hopefully. The church I serve here in town is a part of the United Church of Christ, which is a very liberal Protestant denomination. I don't pretend that I represent the religious community, much less Christianity. I'm just one voice. And the voice of my tradition is one that has historically been very active in social justice issues, particularly over this past generation, and issues related to the church and homosexuality. And it means that I am coming from a more progressive place. That's just who I am. But I don't want to pretend that I have some sort of balanced approach with this. The church I serve here in town, in April of 1993, voted to become what in our tradition is called an open and affirming congregation. In 1984, at the national gathering of the United Church, it was voted that local congregations would be encouraged to enter into a time of discernment and dialogue to see if they would choose to proclaim themselves as being not only open to but affirming of gay and lesbian people in the full experience of the church. The experience I went through with this particular church becoming open and affirming has come to be obvious to me as being the greatest blessing and burden that I've ever gone through in my career as a pastor and in my life as a Christian person. There has been a cost and a joy to it, and it changed this church. It changed my own theology. Part of the process of becoming open and affirming, or ONA as we call it, was a conference that we hosted here. A couple hundred people came from all over Montana to hear a Christian ethicist whose name is Jim Nelson, who used to teach in the Twin Cities. And he was a wonderful presence. But one of the things he said, I'll never forget. He said the question of the church and homosexuality is the defining issue facing the Christian church today. And the last defining issue that faced the Christian church was the abolitionist movement back in the 19th century. Now, there's obviously been all kinds of important issues that have gone on between the abolitionist movement and the movement to becoming an open and affirming faith tradition, the women's movement, the movements in racial justice. But he said defining because this issue, as was true with the abolitionist movement, defined how that church was going to look and how it was going to feel and what direction it was going to go. A defining issue because it is going to define how churches come out in the next few generations. It's that important. I'd like to share one paragraph from a book that Nelson wrote that sort of gives a macro view of this issue. He said, for the greater share of the Christian era, we have been asked essentially a one-directional question concerning religion and sexuality. What does the faith, the Bible, the tradition, current theological opinion, etc., say about our human sexuality, what it means and how we ought to express it? This is an important question that needs constantly to be asked and wrestled with. But there is a second question, equally important. What does our experience as human sexual beings have to say about the way we do theology, read the scriptures, interpret the tradition, and attempt to live out the meanings of the gospel? Which says many things, but one of the things that it suggests to me is that we are living in an evocative time whereby we are looking at the whole integration of the human spirit, living in a way that we look at for the truths in our lives in deeper, more probing ways. And we're hearing voices that have never been heard before. And that makes all the difference in the world. When we became open and affirming in 1993, we were the first church in our tradition north of Denver, east of Seattle, and west of Minneapolis to do that. And I have never been a part, in the liberal church, we oftentimes are accused, oftentimes justly, of being kind of non-emotive, living in our heads and not wanting to, kind of like God's frozen people. And in that process, I heard countless discussions about Scripture and theology between liberals and conservatives. I saw people cry over their faith. I saw lots of people leave the church. I saw lots of people come into the church. And I recognized on some level this was very real. And this was very faithful. And through it, hundreds and hundreds of people at that parish had their lives changed. It was a remarkable experience. Delving into topics for which we are condemned as being heretical, and finding in the heresy a faithfulness that the liberal church is in so much need of. So I encounter it as sort of a new reformation, and that's a very powerful, powerful experience. I don't know if you all are interested in kind of biblical stuff and homosexuality. You can't do it in 5 minutes, but that's an interesting thing. Or issues of marriage and the church. What's kind of more interesting? Bible or marriage? Bible or marriage?
Both.
Both. I want to read a quote. This kind of is a overall thing. It's a guy that used to be the minister, the general minister and president of our denomination. His name was Paul Sherry. But he once wrote, "Confronted and gifted by these baptized persons," and in this sermon he's talking about gay and lesbian people. "Confronted and gifted by these baptized persons, members of the United Church of Christ have been challenged to read the Bible again with new eyes and listen to the Holy Spirit with new ears. We have had to re-examine long-held assumptions about those few passages of Scripture that appear to speak about homosexuality in the light of transforming interpretations from widely respected biblical scholars and teachers. And we have begun to recognize how our fears of those who are different and our society's deeply entrenched bias against homosexual persons has often distorted and nearly silenced the Bible's liberating and inclusive voice. At the same time, encounters with hurting and excluded sisters and brothers have caused us to look to the whole of Scripture, which speaks of a God who continually reaches out for those who were cast out for any reason, those who live at the margins of our lives. We have been reminded of our identity as disciples of the one who often ate with those rejected by the religious norms of the day, the one who sets before us the table of God's inclusive love, mercy, and grace," which I think is sort of a way of getting into the whole notion that in our religious landscape today, at least the way I see it, there is a division between churches who are striving to be more exclusive and those who are striving to be more inclusive. And it kind of renders the liberal conservative thing a little feeble. This article by Andrew Sullivan in today's paper talks about a more inclusive vision of how the world should work. And there is a marked distinction between traditions that go one way and those who go another way. And I'm deeply concerned in the world in which we live that chasm grows wider all the time. That I know, at least in the particularities of my theology and in my calling, I feel deeply called to proclaim a religious voice that is accepting of all of God's people. And I have a deep trust that movement is going to grow. It is growing. It is happening not simply in my tradition, but in every religious tradition in this country, in quiet sorts of ways. But it is happening. I was thinking of a line when Carl was talking about not the icebergs, the glaciers, and how deep all of this stuff is. And a quote of Dr. King's that gets used a lot. He spoke about the whole universe leans towards justice, and how long that takes, and how many tears have to fall, how much joy comes about in the midst of it all, but that it is happening. But in order for that to happen, we have to listen to those who haven't been listened to before. We have to see things with new eyes and to hear them with new ears. We have to be able to hold on. I think one of the hallmarks of the religious life is holding on to these timeless truths, knowing that we have an obligation to proclaim them in timely ways. This time has given us this issue. In and through, from my perspective, God's Spirit. And for that I give great, great thanks.
Well, we do have time for questions. Anybody? First one's always the hardest. I think Katie said last night, I think.
I've been interested in the debate around gay marriage with the words that haven't been mentioned. And the one that strikes me would be fidelity or monogamy, a word that would balance the incredible stereotypes and bigotry about derogatory term of promiscuity that is often described gay people by sort of other political persuasions. And fidelity or monogamy as a term might start a whole different discussion about relationships in the broader transformation of American society where 1 in 2 marriages ends in divorce. And I wondered if you all could comment about what you see the implications of this gay marriage transformation of our society, perhaps opening a new set of discussions of fidelity, of what that means for people.
You took the mic, go for it.
I think that's an intriguing thing. One of the reasons I hesitate to really go into it is that I hate to see gay and lesbian equality as being kind of the beast of burden for a larger discussion about a much larger social issue that we know is really kind of a burning question for a lot of people. It's something that a lot of people struggle with. So I tend to try and stick to the civil, legal aspects, and recognize that the culture is going to tackle it from different ways, and do it that way. I think there is, but certainly we see. I mean, one of the things I have talked about is the Britney effect on the civil marriage discussion, which doesn't necessarily address fidelity or monogamy, but I think it's a piece of the whole, the enormous flexibility that heterosexuals have in managing their marital affairs, and those of you who know, Britney Spears was married for 55 hours, and it was perfectly legal. And then she dissolved it, and that was perfectly legal as well. While a couple who's been together for 51 years and gets married in San Francisco is just railed against by some people in our society. So, in a way, it's a gift that Britney Spears gave, I think. It's a small gift that Britney Spears gave this whole movement. And kind of a reminder that, there is all this flexibility that people have in how they marry and how they manage their marital affairs. And it's hard to rationalize excluding same-gender couples from this enormously flexible institution that we have.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Okay.
There's a great quote, actually, of this Andrew Sullivan thing this morning, too. He says, he has a number of things before, but he says, "This is why I'm troubled by the resistance of so many conservatives to this reform," to stuff in Massachusetts. "It's the most pro-family measure imaginable, keeping families together, building new ones, strengthening the ties between generations." Which I think is very apparent to a lot of people, and to other folks, it's just anathema. So, I think your question is great, though, because part of my tradition is the old Congregationalist ministers would not perform marriages in the 19th century because we felt it was an infringement between the church and state. In the Catholic Church, marriage is a sacrament. But in Protestant churches, it isn't viewed as a sacrament. It's certainly looked at as being very important. But the act of officiating at a function of the state was a real problem. And to this day, I have a problem with it. I always use this story of this old radical Baptist preacher who, every time he does a wedding, the couple comes up and music stops and hush hush, but he whips out the wedding license and he says, "Well, this piece of paper gives these two people the right to sue each other. So we're going to sign that now," and then they'll have them both sign it, and then he takes it and he throws it up in the air and he said, "Now we've rendered to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and we will now render to God that which is God's." So that when I perform marriages, the act of signing that piece of paper is in a very real way sort of a compromise. The act of creating a covenantal relationship predicated on love and fidelity is much more powerful than a piece of paper. And so the stuff, we've been doing same-sex unions in our tradition on and off for quite some time. I don't have any problem with that. There are no papers to sign, which is sort of nice. There will be papers to sign, I think, in the future.
While you're thinking, go ahead.
This is for all three of you. Do any of you have any strategies or plans for any response to the amendment, to the possible amendment to the Montana Constitution to ban gay marriage?
It's okay, none of the three of you are running for office as far as I know.
No, that wasn't the hesitation.
There is a campaign called Montanans for Families and Fairness that was formed by many of our organizations and with the blessing of others, and it is focused solely on the issue of Montana's constitutional amendment, the Marriage Discrimination Amendment. And as many of you may know, the first goal to pass the discrimination amendment is to collect 41,000 signatures around the state in order to get it on the November ballot. And so the first phase, and hopefully definitive phase, of this campaign is to try and make an impact on that signature gathering process. If they don't achieve 41,000 signatures, then it doesn't get on the November ballot, and we've taken care of it for the time being. if it gets on the November ballot, you know, it's going to be like a bigger chore that we're all going to have to deal with. And there are a number of different strategies that they're working on. You know, we've been talking about marriage and the Constitution at Pride and around the state. We've been going to the state fairs for the last 4 years, talking about these issues for 4 years now. So I think, you know, there's a lot of education that's been done and still needs to be done. And actually, you know, I know you didn't rig this, but the field director for the campaign against the constitutional amendment is here tonight, and he's certainly interested in getting people to pledge on to that campaign, and he's very interested in finding volunteers who will head people off from signing these discriminatory petitions. And Chris, you can wave your hand, and people hopefully can visit with you tonight.
I'd like to talk to each and every one of you, so just make a line. And really, we need you. So I was going to stand up and ask a question as well. And the question was, please, you know, not even a question, but a statement. You know, we need you. So we're trying to get at least 100 volunteers in Missoula. But really, you know, this is something you can do. So please talk with me. I know it's kind of crazy time in everyone's life, and it always is. But we don't plan these things. The religious right plans them. So we need to act against it and try to make sure it doesn't happen.
Could I ask a question of this young man? In deference to Pat Robertson. I was wondering, are you going to do an email? And can you gather the names by email at all? The way that we often get these things saying, sign this, sign this, sign this.
Oh yeah, well, we're not gathering the petition. I mean, we're asking people to decline to sign, and we're doing a voter identification effort. But yeah, I mean, there is a pledge sheet going around. What we're looking for now, though, first and foremost, is volunteers to help us. We need to mobilize this community. We need to mobilize the state. So that's the best way to help. If it gets on the ballot, the best way to do it is to identify our supportive voters so that we can turn them out to vote in November, and we can win this thing.
I'm sorry, I realize that I know my ignorance. That's my intelligence. But it's the anti. We are against getting it on the petition. On the
right. What there's an initiative called CI 96 that is out there. They need to get the 41,000 signatures, and this would make the Constitution of this state. It would say that marriage was between a man and a woman, and that I forget the exact wording, but something about that the benefits conveyed through marriage can only be conveyed to men and women. So in the arguments going on in my house, well, I shouldn't say arguments, the debates in my home, what we're really talking about is what this is going to do is amend our Constitution to require people to discriminate. It really is, when you think about this. I mean, it could be used to, say, force companies that choose to give benefits to same-sex couples to stop doing that. I mean, it could really be applied a lot of places. Constitutions are not the place for writing discrimination. Constitutions are supposed to help people so that their government doesn't get into the wrong areas. I mean, we have a DOMA in this state. It is already prohibited for gay and lesbian people to marry, but this is writing discrimination into our Constitution. And if we do it on this issue, what will stop another group from coming in and asking for it on another issue?
So we need, in other words, in our world, we need to be telling all our friends, don't sign it.
Do not sign. The thing is, decline to sign. And I think, and I'm not trying to steal this, it's just that I have a son who's also working on this issue in another city. What they're looking for, individuals that can be at the polling places on June 8th, to talk to people about what that petition is about. Because I think it could be very easily said to people, do you want to protect marriage? Well, yeah, sure, sign here. And people need to understand that those petitions are to amend our Constitution. So they're looking for people that'll go there and talk to the voters and say, please decline to sign. So I think that's what you're asking for.
Thank you.
Just
Might-
one more
Go
thing, if I
ahead.
could. There are five volunteer opportunities coming up as well that are even before June 8th, and we really need people. So I've been on this job for a week, and we have to organize the whole state. So so if you guys help me out, I'd appreciate it. And I think we could get you guys plugged in. It's a lot of fun. We'll do some good work. So.
Yeah, I might interject here, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it just, from what I've read and from the way I understand Constitution, both at the federal level and more specifically at Montana level, traditionally, since the Founding Fathers put the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights into our Constitution, every amendment since then has either been neutral on the idea of rights or has gone in a more opening up of civil rights. The 14th Amendment is a case in point. The 14th Amendment is exactly what the Supreme Court fell back on in justifying the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So ultimately, when things wind up in the courts, as they generally do when they're controversial, this is, it's the basic fundamental law of our land. It's the basic fundamental law of the state of Montana. If something like this gets embedded in our federal or our state constitution, it can change a whole lot of things. It is such a precedent-setting change that it's almost unimaginable. And it goes way beyond the issue of marriage. It goes way, way beyond the issue of gays or anything. It goes to the whole issue of human rights and civil rights.
It's spreading
and,
hatred, isn't
and
it?
where it's at.
And I would say,
It's
if you
justified.
haven't read the Montana Constitution, you should. It is an amazing, inclusive document. It is probably one of the most progressive and inclusive state constitutions in the country. And to amend it to require discrimination against a group of citizens who live in this state, contribute to our society, pay taxes, is just beyond my comprehension. I mean, it just cannot happen. And so that's why it's so important that if you can volunteer, now is the time to do it.
Thank you, I needed that explanation.
I think there was a lady with her hand up.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just had a question, also a comment about all of this. NPR, and I know they're a left news, but they've had a variety of experts on constitutional law for the federal constitutional amendment coming up. It's something that people who might be on the fence at work about would say, okay, these are people who have studied this, and they say, whatever side of the issue you're on, it's just a dangerous road, period.
What would stop a group of people from amending the Constitution to discriminate against Christianity? What would stop them from writing an amendment to the Constitution that said women should have less rights? I mean, it really opens this door to start writing all kinds of discrimination into our Constitution. It just flat out isn't what constitutions are for.
I also had a question from any of you about the school board here in Missoula. The last school board meeting, they were approached by a group of citizens to end Diversity Week in the high schools, and they've decided that they need to take it to committee, meaning that you don't get to hear it because it's now in committee. And so I wanted to find out what that was. I mean, and I know the students spoke beautifully. I heard about it. Defending Diversity Week in their high schools, but I was wondering your comments on what to do with the school board here in Missoula.
Well, there's been so much going on with the school board here in town that I think, as a general rule, we have to be very, very vigilant about what's going on. You mentioned, that this is an idea of the religious right, and I have no interest in bashing the religious right, but I also think people of America who might not identify themselves in that way need to understand that they have a power and an affluence, and they have an agenda that is far deeper and longer than most people think. And one of them is to end things like diversity education in schools. And there has to be a witness to counterbalance that. And talk to your elected school board people. Make your voice heard. Get involved in your PTA. Applaud the efforts of those who are lifting that up. And it will happen. It will happen. But there has to be a vigilance in the midst of it all.
Just a real quick follow-up on something that you mentioned that's going into committee. Having been on a school board for 12 years, we always had to pay really close attention to the open meeting law, and we have a very strongly worded open meeting law in the state of Montana. Those committee meetings should be open to the public. You need to find out when they are, and if you can't make it, make sure somebody who shares your point of view is in there. So even though it's been assigned to a committee, which is kind of traditionally the way they do things with District 1, you should be entitled to be there. I have a question.
Just in response to that, I actually know from Carol Bowen, who's on the school board, that there is a committee meeting where they're probably going to be addressing that next Tuesday, and I think it's at 5. I'm not sure exactly. Carol knows, but
If you're not sure, call the district administration office. I'm sure they can tell you.
it is definitely open, and people should go.
If you can't go, I think you can get the minutes, or someone should be able to get the minutes. But it is definitely important that people hear your voice. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, this stuff is happening in Missoula. We deal with Pride with the whole state. We deal with anti-gay groups, the anti-gay industry around the state. And in Missoula, we find some of the most well-organized, most vocal anti-gay activity happening. And I love Missoula. I live here, so I'm not bashing it. But vigilance is absolutely necessary. We've got people trying to inject their religion into school board stuff and the way schools are operated. We have a newspaper that's discriminating by putting gay and lesbian marriage announcements way in the back with no photo. We have city officials who, when the issue of equality comes up, they send around a little poll to see if all the employees in the city agree that discrimination should end, like a popularity contest. You can imagine what kind of response they get. And we have police and law enforcement here that finds civil rights organizations and organizers suspect in the work that they do. So we need to be really aware of this stuff happening here in Missoula and challenge it wherever we can. But I don't want that to be a depressing note. Missoula is also very groovy. Groovy doesn't always vote, though, and it should.
I saw you with your hand up.
I'm just curious. Do you have any idea of where this petition originated? I mean, who? Is there some group, identifiable group
that's trying to amend the Constitution?
Yeah. Do they have a name?
It's the Montana Family Foundation.
Montana?
Right?
The Montana Family Foundation. They are affiliated with Focus on the Family, a national organization that has spots on one of our television stations every day. Focus on the Family is really the tail that's wagged the marriage discrimination dog across the nation, and they were instrumental. Focus on the Family was instrumental in creating the language for the federal marriage amendment, and then they've been sponsoring their state affiliates to do similar stuff on the state level. The Montana Family Foundation is run by a current legislator who knows the ins and outs of politics in the state quite well.
Yeah, I'd like to go to the web and find out more about
Yeah, they're there under Montana Family Foundation.
The Dr. James Dobson, who's on television a lot, he's in charge of that thing out of Colorado.
What's interesting to me on those spots that we see at noontime from Focus on the Family is often when I'm listening to it, I find myself in agreement with what he's saying. I find sometimes his advice on parenting to be right on. I'm like, yeah. It was only after I started to do some research on the group that I understood that family only looks a certain way to this organization. and certainly doesn't include my family would not be recognized by them because we have gay and lesbian members in our family. But it's just one of those things that we have to recognize that they are really organizing in this state and trying to make an impact here. And they think they can make an impact because they think there is an underlying kind of bias or dislike that they can feed off of. And most groups, whether they be white supremacist groups or anti-environmentalists or whatever, are really trying to feed off basic kind of hidden, unspoken resentments or biases that we have. The other thing I found fascinating about the Focus on the Family, they're based in Colorado Springs, and that's where the representative is from who introduced this into the House of the federal legislation. So they're all like tied together. It's very interesting kind of stuff.
It's also where the Catholic bishop is from, I think, who said that anyone voting in a certain way in an election is not entitled to receive the sacrament.
I would also encourage folks to encourage whatever leaders they might have in whatever community of faith they might be a part of. A lot of these movements that come about are predicated on the assumption that a lot of good people will keep their mouths shut. And non-right-wing religious groups are out there, oftentimes feeling very shackled by speaking out in favor of human rights. And if you are a member of a group, lift your voice up. It might not be popular, but it does make a profound difference. Let your pastors know, your rabbis know, whoever, thank you for standing on the side of human rights. Because, by and large, if you take a stand, you don't hear that very much. And do that. And speak up in your own communities. That's the way it has to happen. It doesn't happen any other way. And complaining about what the right wing is doing, that dog doesn't walk very far. We need to stand where we stand.
And you might be surprised the response you'll get from your minister, those of you who are members of churches. A week ago, I simply asked our pastor if he would include the agenda for this particular program at the library in the church bulletin, and he was glad to do that. It went in our church bulletin, and it was even announced prior to the service that this was going on. So they can be responsive. I'm not saying all of them are going to be that way, but I think a lot more of them are going to than you might think.
Well, and perhaps even in a more powerful way, for those folks who are a part of more conservative religious traditions, lift up your voice. We're not called to just be a bunch of sheep following in the way. Oftentimes, in a real liberal church, you assume that everybody's liberal. Not everybody is. And you assume in a real conservative community of faith that everybody's conservative. Not true at all, particularly on this issue. And, there's a conspiracy of silence that goes on in organizational structures. Break the silence. Start telling the truth. It makes a difference.
No, I just want to say, there's a member of my family who is gay, but he's too scared to have a relationship, too scared to come out of the closet. And I'd like to see him have a better life than he does.
Sure.
And if the climate changes, that's possible.
Well, and there are, it's not just individual people who may or may not be in the closet. There's organizations that are oftentimes in the closet, and there's organizations that have come out of the closet, and that represents a lot of hope, real, live, true stories, and oftentimes because of that conspiracy of silence, people don't know about that, and so they live in isolation, and that whole hope of living in an inclusive community is lost.
You were just talking about, Peter, kind of brings a question to my mind, and you alluded to the fact that one of the things that you read during your talk, that on the civil rights issue, some of the defining moment, the last defining moment in churches was the abolition movement. And as I'm sure you know, the abolition movement led to a complete split of a lot of churches in half. You know, that's the reason we have the Baptists and the Southern Baptists, for example. Do you see this potentially happening with this issue now, since it is such a defining moment?
I think we're going to see unbelievable fragmentations and changes in denominational life as we've known it. I think that many of the large Protestant denominations are going to fracture between the left and the right, the inclusive, the exclusive, whatever, and the right-wing churches will find each other and, you know, create new groups, and the progressive side will do the same. And certainly seen it in my own denomination, and we're probably 15, 20 years ahead of other denominations with this. But yeah, it's so hard, but it also creates an incredible dynamic, and it's the dynamic that, you know, we live in fear of the conflict that creates new life. But there is new life. You know, there's thunder on the horizon, but there is also this dawn, and it's happening.
Further questions? Thank you all for coming. Thanks for